My name is Philip. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside structured systems, offices with org charts, performance metrics, and carefully worded emails that pretend to be neutral while carrying a lot of unspoken power. I've never been the loud one in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't have confidence. I tend to listen longer than people expect, and I speak only when I'm sure of what I'm saying. Because of that, people often mistake me for being uncomplicated, easy, someone who will absorb pressure quietly and keep things moving without complaint. I've been described as dependable, low maintenance, and once, by someone who thought it was a compliment, not political. What they usually mean is that I don't demand attention, I don't escalate, I don't create scenes. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic way. It's about something much quieter and much more common. It's about what happens when you ask a fair question inside an unfair system, and how quickly that system can turn cold when you disrupt its comfort. At one point in my career, I was put on a performance improvement plan after asking for overtime pay. That sentence alone sounds dramatic, but I want to be clear. Nothing exploded. No one yelled. No doors were slammed. In fact, everything was delivered with professional smiles and carefully documented language. That's what made it so disorienting. What followed wasn't a single event, but a slow sequence of realizations about how value is measured, about how silence is often misinterpreted as consent, and about how timing, especially in corporate environments, is rarely accidental. The timing was not a coincidence. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through what that experience actually felt like from the inside. Not just what happened, but how it changed the way I understand power, self-respect, and restraint. There are moments of disappointment here, and moments of clarity, but there's no villain monologue, no sudden triumph, just cause and effect. I'm sharing this story for anyone who's ever been quietly dependable and later realized that dependability was being used against them. For anyone who has followed the rules, trusted the process, and then felt confused when the process turned on them without warning. This is a story about emotional justice, not emotional release, about choosing precision over noise, and about learning that sometimes the most decisive shifts happen without an audience. As you listen, I invite you to notice not just what I did, but what I didn't do. And maybe ask yourself gently, have you ever been underestimated because you didn't feel the need to announce your strength? To them, I was reliable in a way that barely registered. The kind of person whose work only became visible when it wasn't done, which in my case, almost never happened. I arrived early, not conspicuously so, just early enough to be settled before the day started. I stayed late when things ran long. I filled gaps without announcing I was doing it. If someone missed a deadline, I adjusted. If a process broke, I patched it quietly and made a note to fix it properly later. I didn't present myself as ambitious. That wasn't strategic, it was simply how I was. I believed that consistency would eventually speak for itself. That if you were precise, fair, and dependable long enough, someone would notice, not in a performative way, but in a grounded, adult way. I thought recognition arrived slowly, like trust. In meetings, I was rarely challenged, not because my ideas were dominant, but because they were unthreatening, practical, delivered without edge. When I spoke, people nodded, typed notes, and moved on. No resistance, no excitement. I learned early that being agreeable without being memorable places you in a very specific category. Useful, but replaceable in theory, even if not in practice. My manager described me as steady. Another once said, "Philip doesn't need much managing." I understood that as praise at the time. It meant freedom, autonomy, or so I thought. What it really meant was that I was low risk, low noise, someone whose boundaries were assumed rather than tested, until they were. I noticed how differently others were handled. People who pushed back were labeled strong personalities. People who asked for clarity were detail-oriented. People who asked for more were hungry. I didn't ask for much. I didn't push. And so I wasn't given language at all. I was background stability, the floor that doesn't get thanked for holding the room up. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being competent without spectacle. It doesn't feel like neglect at first. It feels like peace. You're left alone, trusted. But over time, that absence of friction becomes an absence of acknowledgement. You're no longer someone whose needs are anticipated. You're someone whose capacity is assumed to be endless. When workloads increased, mine increased quietly. When projects were behind, my name was added without discussion. Not because I was the best choice, but because I was the safest one. I wouldn't say no, or rather, they believed I wouldn't, because I hadn't needed to before. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I understood the logic. Systems reward predictability. I was predictable. I delivered exactly what was asked in the time frame promised with minimal oversight. That made me valuable, but it also made me legible in a very narrow way. No one asked what it cost. Outside the office, I was the same person, measured, thoughtful. I don't escalate emotionally. I don't raise my voice to feel powerful. I believe words matter more when they're used sparingly. That temperament served me well in many areas of life, but in that environment, it flattened me into something easier to manage. Looking back, I can see how I was framed. Not explicitly, no one ever said this aloud, but through patterns. I was the person you looped in when something needed fixing without fuss. The person you trusted with sensitive tasks because I wouldn't gossip. The person you didn't worry about losing because people like me don't leave suddenly. We don't threaten, we adapt. And adaptation, when it's one-sided, becomes expectation. If you had asked my colleagues who I was, they would have said I was dependable. Maybe quiet, maybe solid. None of that is untrue, but it's incomplete. What they didn't see was how carefully I was paying attention, how much I noticed the small shifts, who was protected, who was challenged, who was given grace, and who was simply expected to absorb. I wasn't invisible because I lacked presence. I was invisible because I made it easy not to look too closely. At that stage, I still believed that fairness, when requested calmly and reasonably, would be met the same way. I hadn't yet learned that some systems interpret calm requests not as professionalism, but as permission. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't arrive with warning, and they don't bleed enough to demand immediate attention. They just register, quietly, and then they stay with you. For me, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a short exchange that, at the time, I filed away as awkward rather than wrong. We had been working extended hours for weeks, not officially declared overtime, just a busy season, the kind everyone is expected to push through without making a thing of it. I tracked my time carefully, mostly for my own sense of order. I noticed how many evenings blurred into nights, how often I logged off well past what my role technically required. So I asked. Not emotionally, not publicly. I sent a brief, polite message to my manager asking how overtime was handled for our team, given the sustained workload. I framed it neutrally, almost apologetically. I assumed there was a process I had simply missed. The response came later that day. It was short, vague, non-committal. Something along the lines of, "Let's talk about this later," followed by a smiley face that felt oddly out of place. We did talk later. In a small conference room. The door is half open. The tone is calm enough to seem reassuring. I was told that overtime wasn't really how we did things at my level, that flexibility was part of the role, that everyone was pitching in. Nothing accusatory, but nothing concrete either. What struck me wasn't the answer, it was the shift. The conversation ended with a subtle redirection, a question about my capacity, a comment about alignment, a suggestion that maybe I was feeling stretched because I needed to prioritize differently. None of it is overt, none of it is aggressive. But the implication landed cleanly. The issue wasn't the workload. It was me noticing it. I nodded. I listened. I didn't argue. I left the room with the same calm I had entered with. On the surface, nothing had changed. But something had. In the days that followed, I became more aware of how I was being observed. Not watched closely, just noted. Small things. A comment about response time. A question about whether I was comfortable handling multiple projects. Language that framed concern as support, but felt misaligned with my actual performance. No one else mentioned overtime again. No announcement, no clarification. The silence around the topic was complete. It was as if asking had closed a door rather than opened a conversation. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, the office nearly empty, and realizing that the discomfort I felt wasn't about money. It was about a boundary. I had gently named one, and the system had responded by tightening. That's when I understood that the cut wasn't in what they said. It was in what they no longer assumed. Before, my reliability was unquestioned. After, it felt conditional. Still, I told myself not to overinterpret. I rationalized. I've always been good at that. I assumed good intent. I reminded myself that organizations are imperfect, that managers are human, that not every shift is personal. I continued working the same way I always had. But I didn't forget. There's a difference between reacting and remembering. Reacting is loud. Remembering is quiet and much more enduring. I didn't change my tone. I didn't complain. I didn't escalate. But I started paying closer attention to language, to timing, to who was allowed to ask for what without consequence. That first small cut taught me something important. Respect doesn't always disappear all at once. Sometimes it recedes just enough to see whether you'll notice. I noticed. After that conversation, nothing dramatic happened, and that, in many ways, was the problem. Disrespect, when delivered in small, reasonable doses, has a way of blending into routine. It doesn't announce itself as harm. It presents as an adjustment, as feedback, as growth. I kept doing my job. The workload didn't decrease. If anything, it expanded. New responsibilities were added with the same casual phrasing as always. Can you take this on? You're good at this. It shouldn't take long. I said yes because I could, and because saying no still felt disproportionate, as if I'd be making something out of nothing. I told myself this was temporary, that asking about overtime had simply made me more visible, and that visibility came with scrutiny. That was fair, I reasoned. Systems react when patterns change. I had disrupted one. Of course, there would be recalibration, but recalibration only seemed to move in one direction. Feedback that had once been sparse and positive became more frequent and less specific. Phrases like, "We just want to make sure you're staying engaged," or "This is about expectations at this level," started appearing in one-on-ones. No concrete failures were cited, no metrics were missed. Still, the tone shifted from trust to assessment. I found myself preparing more than necessary, double-checking emails, anticipating questions that were never asked, providing context that no one had requested. It wasn't fear, it was an attempt to reestablish equilibrium, to signal that I was still the same steady presence they had relied on before. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was helping normalize the new dynamic. By accommodating without naming the change, I made it easier for everyone else to pretend it wasn't happening. Others didn't see it, or didn't want to. Colleagues joked about being tired, about long hours, about earning their stripes. There was a quiet pride in endurance. To question it was to step outside the unspoken agreement that suffering, if shared, didn't need to be examined. So I stayed inside it. I told myself that my calm was a strength, that I was above office politics, that I didn't need to push back to maintain dignity. There's a particular comfort in believing you're immune to dynamics that seem to trap others. It allows you to endure longer than you should. But endurance has a cost when it replaces consent. I began to notice how often my boundaries were assumed rather than discussed. Meetings are scheduled outside my availability without checking. Deadlines moved up without consultation. Tasks reframed as expectations after I'd already completed them once as a favor. Each instance on its own was minor, easy to excuse, but together they formed a pattern. My flexibility was no longer optional. It was part of my role, though never documented as such. And because it wasn't documented, it couldn't be acknowledged or protected. I didn't confront anyone about this. Not because I was afraid, but because I still believed clarity would emerge organically, that someone would eventually say, "We've been leaning on you a lot," or "We should formalize this." I believed in course correction without conflict. Instead, the language around me continued to shift. Words like ownership and resilience were used to frame increased demands as opportunities. The message was subtle but consistent. If you struggled, it was a matter of personal growth, not structural imbalance. I absorbed that framing more than I realized. I internalized the idea that if something felt off, it was my responsibility to adjust, to manage my energy better, to be more efficient, to become somehow even quieter. There's a strange moment when you realize you've started editing yourself preemptively, when you stop asking questions, not because they're unreasonable, but because you've learned how they'll be received. That's when normalization is complete. I still didn't think of myself as disrespected. That word felt too heavy, too dramatic. I thought of myself as adapting, being professional, staying focused. But adaptation, when it's expected rather than chosen, erodes something essential. It blurs the line between contribution and compliance. And once that line is blurred, it becomes very easy for others to step over it, without ever feeling like they've done anything wrong. By the time I noticed how far the line had moved, it no longer felt natural to point to where it used to be. The realization didn't come all at once. It arrived gradually, through repetition, through patterns that became too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. I began to understand that I wasn't just adapting to the system. I had been assigned a role within it, not formally, not on paper, but clearly. Clearly, I was the reliable one. The person who would carry things through when others dropped them. The one who could be trusted not to escalate, not to complain, not to require reassurance. My calm had become a utility. My silence is a feature. I saw it in how work was distributed. Tasks that required patience, follow-through, or emotional neutrality found their way to me, not because I volunteered, but because I had a history of absorbing them without friction. When something sensitive needed handling, I was included. When something tedious needed finishing, I was remembered. But when decisions were made, real decisions, about direction or resources, I was rarely consulted. My value was operational, not strategic. I was there to stabilize outcomes, not shape them. Once I saw this, I couldn't unsee it. In meetings, I noticed how my contributions were treated differently from others. When I raised a concern, it was reframed as a detail. When someone else raised the same point later, it was treated as insight. The difference wasn't content, it was expectation. I wasn't expected to challenge, so when I did, it didn't quite land. There was a kind of politeness around me, a soft dismissal. I wasn't arguing, I was managed around. The role came with unspoken rules. Be available, be adaptable, don't personalize, don't ask for more than what's already been offered. In return, I was granted a certain stability. No one threatened my position, no one questioned my competence outright, but no one protected my limits either. I realized that the system didn't see me as someone with leverage, just capacity. And capacity, when it's abundant and unguarded, invites use. What unsettled me wasn't that others benefited from my work. That's how collaboration functions. It was that my consent had slowly been removed from the equation. I was no longer choosing to give more. It was simply assumed that I would. The moment this crystallized for me was quiet. I was added to a project late, after planning had already been done, because someone else had pushed back on the timeline. The justification was delivered casually. We knew you'd handle it. It was meant as trust. It landed as certainty. That's when I understood the role fully. I wasn't the person whose time was negotiated. I was the person whose time was absorbed. I was the buffer between ambition and reality, between poor planning and functional outcomes. And buffers are rarely thanked. They're expected. I didn't feel angry. I felt clarified. There's a difference. Anger looks outward. Clarity turns inward and asks harder questions. What had I taught them about me? I had taught them that I would remain composed regardless of strain, that I wouldn't force discomfort into the room, that I valued harmony over recognition. None of that was false, but it was incomplete. And in its incompleteness, it had been used to define my ceiling. I began to see how early impressions harden into roles, how the system rewards those who assert and reallocates from those who absorb, not out of malice, but out of efficiency. Once a role proves functional, it's reinforced. I didn't blame anyone for this, not individually, but I did stop blaming myself for noticing it. Awareness, I realized, wasn't disloyalty. It was a responsibility. I still hadn't decided what to do with that awareness, but something fundamental had shifted. I no longer believed that staying quiet would eventually rebalance things. I no longer believed that being indispensable guaranteed protection. The role I was assigned was clear. What remained unclear was whether I would continue to perform it. The day something shifted didn't come with a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voice, no moment where I finally said what I'd been holding back. In fact, externally, it looked like an ordinary day, one that would have blended into dozens of others, if not for what happened internally. It was late afternoon. The office had that drained, end-of-day quiet where people are technically still working, but mentally elsewhere. I was reviewing a document that had already passed through several hands, fixing small inconsistencies no one else had time for. This was familiar territory, comfortably invisible. An email notification appeared. Another task, another quick ask. Framed politely, of course, always politely. I remember pausing before opening it, not out of irritation, but awareness. A subtle recognition that my body had learned this pattern before my mind had fully articulated it. I already knew what the email would contain. Not the specifics, but the assumption behind it. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised. What surprised me was my reaction, or rather, the absence of one. No tightening, no internal negotiation, just stillness. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced clearly, without emotion attached. I don't actually have to respond to this the way I always have. That was it. No dramatic revelation, no surge of anger, just a quiet interruption of an old reflex. For years, my default had been immediate accommodation. Even when I said I'd get to something later, I acknowledged it right away. I made sure no one felt delayed by me. I protected the system from its own inefficiencies. This time I didn't. I closed the email. Not to ignore it, but to decide when and how I would engage. For the first time, I placed my response inside my own timing, not theirs. The shift wasn't about refusal, it was about authorship. I finished what I was doing. I packed up. I left at a reasonable hour. Nothing fell apart. No alarms sounded. The world didn't punish me for stepping out of alignment with the role I'd been performing. That evening, I thought about how often I'd confused calm with compliance, how being emotionally regulated had slowly turned into being emotionally absent from my own experience. I realized I had been managing other people's expectations more carefully than my own well-being. The next day, I noticed something else. No one followed up urgently. The task remained. The urgency, it turned out, had been manufactured by habit. That was the moment the system revealed itself, not as fragile, but as opportunistic. It expanded to fill whatever capacity was offered. And I had been offering mine without conditions. I didn't announce a change. I didn't explain myself. I simply stopped preemptively smoothing things over. I responded when it made sense. I asked clarifying questions instead of absorbing ambiguity. Small adjustments, barely visible from the outside. Inside, though, something had recalibrated. I began to see my silence differently. It wasn't just absence, it was space. Space to observe without participating automatically. Space to decide whether a request aligned with my role or merely with someone else's convenience. This wasn't empowerment in the motivational sense. It was grounded, almost mundane, but it was irreversible. Once you see that your compliance has been optional all along, it's impossible to unsee. I also noticed how much of my value had been tied to anticipation. I had been rewarded for solving problems before they became visible. Now, by waiting, I allowed visibility to return, to others. Gaps appeared, timelines stretched. Responsibility redistributed itself, slowly and without drama. No one accused me of changing. No one needed to. The system simply adjusted around the new shape I was quietly holding. That day didn't change my job, it changed my posture. And posture, I learned, determines far more than position ever does. Once the shift happened, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It became something I chose. That distinction mattered. Before, my quiet had been passive, a byproduct of temperament, of not wanting to create friction. Now, it was intentional, measured. I spoke when it added clarity, and I didn't when it didn't. I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. From the outside, nothing about this looked assertive. There were no declarations, no boundary-setting speeches. If anything, I probably seemed less engaged, less urgent. And that, I suspect, is why no one challenged it directly. Silence, when it changes form, often goes unnoticed. What did change was how others interpreted it. Without my constant availability, small inefficiencies surfaced. Questions that I used to anticipate were now asked later. Tasks lingered longer before being resolved. And in those delays, assumptions began to form. I could sense it in tone. In the slight pauses during meetings, when someone realized I wasn't going to jump in automatically. In the meantime, my name stopped appearing as a default solution. Not removed, just withheld. There's a common mistake people make when someone quits compensating. They assume capacity has dropped, that the silence signals disengagement or weakness. It rarely occurs to them that restraint might be deliberate. I let that misunderstanding stand. When asked directly if everything was okay, I answered truthfully and briefly. Yes. I didn't over-explain. I didn't reassure beyond what was asked. I didn't offer additional labor as proof of commitment. This made some people uncomfortable. They were used to my emotional availability as much as my professional one. I had been a steady presence. Now I was a neutral one. Neutrality, it turns out, is unsettling in systems built on predictability. I began documenting more carefully, not out of fear, but out of respect for reality. I tracked timelines, requests, and changes in scope. I kept my notes factual, dates, language, outcomes. Not as ammunition, but as orientation. I wanted to understand the system as it actually functioned, not as it claimed to. My silence gave me bandwidth to observe. Who spoke first in meetings? Whose concerns were validated? Whose mistakes were contextualized? And whose were isolated? Patterns sharpened when I stopped buffering them. And still, I didn't confront anyone. There's a misconception that power shifts require announcement. In my experience, they require patience. The less I reacted, the more clearly others revealed their expectations. The less I volunteered, the more visible the distribution of responsibility became. Some people filled the space, others resented it. No one named it. At one point, a manager remarked, half joking, that I'd become harder to read. I smiled. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, and it told me everything I needed to know. Being readable had been part of my role. Predictable reactions, reliable accommodation. Now, without those cues, I was no longer easy to manage around. Silence did something else, too. It decoupled my sense of worth from immediate usefulness. I stopped measuring my value by how quickly I could resolve someone else's urgency. I started noticing how often urgency was manufactured to avoid accountability elsewhere. This wasn't withdrawal. I still did my work, and I did it well, but I did it within clearer boundaries, most of which I never stated aloud. They were simply enacted. People often talk about boundaries as lines you draw. In practice, they're shapes you inhabit, and once you occupy a new shape consistently, others adjust, or they don't. Either way, clarity emerges. By choosing silence strategically, I wasn't hiding, I was listening. And in that listening, I began to understand just how much had been taken for granted, not because it was demanded, but because it was freely given for too long. They thought my quiet meant I was still absorbing. I was, in fact, preparing. What they never noticed was how much room silence creates when you stop using it to protect others from discomfort. Without the constant pull of urgency, I had time to see the system clearly, not as a set of personalities or isolated decisions, but as a structure, one that relied heavily on informal labor, blurred roles, and unspoken agreements. The kind of structure that works well when everyone stays compliant and strains the moment someone asks a precise question. I began by observing patterns. Who assigned work and how? Who approved decisions and when? Which tasks were formally recognized and which ones simply disappeared into expectation? I compared what was written in job descriptions to what was actually being done. The gap between those two things was wider than anyone acknowledged. This wasn't detective work. It was attentiveness. I started organizing my notes more deliberately. Dates, requests, follow-ups, changes in scope. I captured language verbatim, not to weaponize it, but to preserve it. Memory, I'd learned, becomes unreliable when pressure is applied. Documentation does not. At the same time, I began learning quietly about labor standards, about how overtime was defined legally, not culturally, about performance improvement plans, what they were designed for, how they were typically used, and how often they appeared shortly after employees raised compensation-related questions. The patterns weren't dramatic, they were statistical. I also paid attention to timing, how concerns were raised right before review cycles, how feedback was framed when someone became inconvenient, how quickly supportive check-ins could shift into formal processes if the narrative required it. None of this made me angry. It made me precise. I didn't share my findings. Not with colleagues, not with management. Preparation, I realized, is compromised the moment it becomes visible. People respond differently when they know they're being observed. Instead, I positioned myself. I tightened my output. I clarified deliverables in writing. I followed up on verbal requests with summaries. Polite, light, neutral, unremarkable. I reduced ambiguity wherever I could, knowing that ambiguity was the system's favorite hiding place. I also stopped absorbing unpaid labor. Gradually, without announcement, I worked within defined hours. When additional time was required, I documented it. Not confrontationally, just accurately. This had a subtle effect. Tasks that relied on my unspoken flexibility now required discussion. Decisions that had been deferred now had to be made. My absence from the margins forced the system to engage with its own inefficiencies. Still, no one noticed me preparing. They saw consistency, professionalism, maybe a bit of distance, nothing alarming. That's the advantage of being underestimated. You're rarely interrupted. I learned who kept records and who relied on recollection, who followed policy and who improvised, who had authority and who merely performed it. I noticed how often culture was used to override written standards, and how selectively. At one point, I reviewed my own performance history. It was clean, consistently positive. No documented issues, no warnings, no missed targets. That mattered, not emotionally, but structurally. I understood then that leverage isn't always something you acquire. Sometimes it's something you realize you've had all along. What they never noticed was that I wasn't waiting for fairness to appear. I was aligning myself with it quietly, piece by piece. I wasn't preparing to confront, I was preparing to understand. Understanding creates options. Options create power. And power, when held calmly, doesn't need to announce itself. By the time the system shifted again, as it always does, I wasn't surprised. I was ready. Not in the sense of anticipation, but in the sense of orientation. I knew where I stood, what I had contributed, and what had been asked without consent. I also knew something else, something more important. Whatever came next, I wouldn't be navigating it reactively. I had already stepped out of the role that required me to absorb quietly. What they never noticed was that while they were evaluating me, I had been studying the environment that made those evaluations possible, and I understood it better than they realized. The private reveal didn't feel like a victory. There was no moment of satisfaction, no sense of being vindicated. It felt closer to quiet confirmation, the kind you sit with alone, knowing it changes things even if nothing else does. It happened gradually, as most truths do when you're not rushing them. Through my documentation, a pattern had become undeniable. The timeline was clean, almost too clean. My request for overtime clarification, the soft reframing of my capacity, the shift in feedback tone, the introduction of language around alignment and expectations. All of it clustered tightly together. And then there was the policy, not the one everyone referenced casually, but the one written down. The one buried in internal documentation and cross-referenced with local labor standards. It was unambiguous. Sustained additional hours required either compensation or a formal adjustment of role and pay. Flexibility was not a substitute. It was an exception, meant to be temporary. I hadn't imagined the misalignment. I had lived inside it. The more I read, the clearer it became that the system wasn't simply inefficient. It was exposed. Not legally dramatic, but structurally fragile. It depended on people like me not asking precise questions, not documenting, not noticing how quickly support turned into scrutiny when cost entered the conversation. The most revealing detail wasn't the policy itself. It was the timing. The moment I asked about overtime, the narrative around my performance began to shift without any corresponding change in output. That wasn't random. It was defensive. I didn't feel anger when I saw it laid out so clearly. I felt still. There's a particular calm that comes from knowing you're not misreading reality, from having your experience corroborated by structure rather than emotion. This was leverage, but not in the cinematic sense. It wasn't something to brandish. It was something to hold. I understood then why performance improvement plans are often framed as support. They create documentation where none existed before. They shift focus from systems to individuals, and when timed correctly, they dilute the impact of prior concerns by reframing them as symptoms of underperformance. It was elegant, in a way, and deeply impersonal. I also understood that the leverage wasn't just about policy. It was about narrative, about sequence, about whose version of events would appear coherent on paper. Mine was. I didn't tell anyone what I'd discovered. There was nothing to gain from sharing it prematurely. Knowledge, when disclosed too early, invites negotiation. I wasn't interested in negotiating reality. Instead, I adjusted internally. I stopped wondering whether I'd been too sensitive or not resilient enough. Those questions fell away naturally once I saw the system clearly. Doubt requires ambiguity. Clarity dissolves it. I also didn't rush to act. Leverage matures when you allow it to. When you understand not just what you have, but when it matters. This wasn't about winning. It was about alignment, with my values, with the facts, with my own sense of agency. Whatever I chose to do next needed to reflect that alignment, not just correct an imbalance. The private reveal taught me something unexpected. Restraint is easier when you're no longer seeking validation, when you don't need acknowledgement to trust your own reading of events. I kept doing my job. I met expectations. I remained calm. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, everything had. I knew now that the system's response to my initial question wasn't accidental. It was procedural, predictable, designed to discourage exactly the kind of clarity I had pursued. And I knew something else, too. If I chose to move forward, I would do so without heat, without accusation, without spectacle, quietly, on record, in sequence. Not to punish, but to stop participating in a story that required my silence to function. The decision point didn't arrive as a crisis. There was no deadline forcing my hand, no ultimatum delivered across a desk. That in some ways made it harder. I wasn't reacting to pressure. I was choosing direction. I laid out my options privately, the way I do with anything that matters. Slowly, without drama. I could stay. Continue working within the adjusted posture I had adopted. Protect my time quietly, limit my exposure, and accept that the ceiling I'd discovered was unlikely to move. This option promised stability, predictability. It also required ongoing restraint, an agreement, unspoken but binding, to remain legible only in the ways the system found comfortable. I could confront the issue directly, request a formal correction, name the sequence, ask for acknowledgement. This option appealed to the part of me that still believed clarity could repair trust. But it also assumed that the system would respond neutrally to being seen. My preparation suggested otherwise. Or I could choose an option that, once taken, couldn't be undone. Not explosive, not punitive, just definitive. The more I sat with these choices, the clearer it became that this wasn't about overtime or performance plans. It was about authorship, about whether I wanted my professional narrative shaped reactively by policies deployed after the fact, or intentionally on my own terms. I realized something else. Staying, even quietly, required me to continue participating in a structure that had already shown me how it handled fairness when it became inconvenient. That knowledge changed the ethical weight of inaction. I wasn't afraid of consequences. I was wary of erosion, of becoming someone who knew better and chose comfort anyway. The irreversible option didn't require an announcement. It required preparation, which I already had. It meant aligning my actions with the reality I'd uncovered, rather than hoping the reality would eventually align with me. I didn't rush the decision. I slept on it. Several times. Each morning the answer felt the same. Not emotionally urgent, but steady. Once chosen, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a release. I took steps quietly, updated records, reviewed timelines, ensured everything I had done and would do was clean, accurate, and complete. No dramatics, no signaling, just closure, built methodically. What made the decision irreversible wasn't the action itself, but the internal commitment behind it. Once I accepted that the system's response to my initial question had been intentional, I couldn't pretend neutrality was still mutual. That understanding closed a door, not angrily, permanently. I didn't need to be seen as right. I needed to stop participating in something that required me to minimize my own clarity to function smoothly. The decision point, I learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the moment you stop negotiating with yourself. After that, everything else was execution. Once the decision was made, I moved carefully and quietly. Not because I was hiding, but because there was no advantage in being seen. Visibility changes behavior. Silence preserves accuracy. I began by tightening my work to its most defensible form. Everything I delivered was clear, complete, and documented. I stopped improvising solutions that lived only in my head. If a task required additional time or resources, that requirement was stated plainly, in writing, before the work began. This alone created subtle friction, not conflict, just pause. Requests that once sailed through now require confirmation. Timelines had to be acknowledged rather than assumed. I wasn't obstructing anything. I was simply refusing to absorb ambiguity. I reviewed my employment records carefully, contracts, role definitions, past evaluations. I noted what was written and what wasn't. The absence of documented performance issues before a certain point stood out starkly. It didn't need interpretation. It spoke for itself. I also sought external orientation, not advice in the dramatic sense, just information. Quiet conversations, public resources. I wanted to ensure that whatever steps I took next were grounded, proportional, and clean. Throughout all of this, I remained steady at work. No visible disengagement, no emotional withdrawal. If anything, I became more consistent. That consistency served as camouflage. People tend to notice change when it's emotional. Structural change often passes unremarked. Meetings continued. Emails circulated. The surface of things remained smooth. Behind that surface, however, the system was adjusting to my absence in places it had relied on me without realizing it. Small delays, reassigned tasks, questions redirected elsewhere. Nothing alarming, just enough to register eventually as an inconvenience. Still, no one connected it to me. That's the paradox of quiet contribution. When you stop over-contributing, the resulting gaps are rarely traced back to you directly. They're attributed to process issues, resource constraints, or busy periods. The individual who once absorbed those gaps remains unexamined. I let that misattribution stand. I didn't correct narratives. I didn't defend myself preemptively. There was no need. The record I was building wasn't for persuasion, it was for integrity. At one point, a check-in was scheduled, framed as supportive. The tone was neutral. I answered questions honestly and succinctly. I didn't volunteer extra context. I didn't attempt to manage impressions. I trusted the structure to hold what I was doing. Silence by now had become second nature. Not the silence of avoidance, but of restraint. Every action I took was reversible in isolation, but together, they formed a direction that wasn't. I noticed how little attention this drew, how easily systems continue operating while individuals reposition within them. No alarms, no interventions, just momentum. That told me something important. The system wasn't concerned with my internal alignment. It was concerned with output. As long as output remained stable, everything else was background noise. That realization removed any lingering hesitation. I wasn't betraying anything by moving quietly. I was respecting the system's own priorities. By the time consequences began to surface, I was already elsewhere, mentally, structurally, ethically. Not detached, but complete. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about refusing to perform a transformation for an audience that only responds to disruption. I didn't need disruption. I needed resolution. The consequences didn't arrive as a reckoning. There was no moment where someone suddenly realized what had changed and why. Instead, there was a gradual sense of loss, diffuse, uncomfortable, and difficult to name. It started with small inefficiencies, a report that took longer than expected, a process that stalled because a detail hadn't been resolved early, a meeting that ended with more questions than answers. None of this was catastrophic, but it was unfamiliar. People began circling back on things I used to anticipate. Emails arrived asking for clarification on steps I had once handled without prompting. Decisions lingered longer, waiting for someone to take ownership that had previously been implicit. That someone had been me. Still, no one said my name. The system didn't experience this as my absence. It experienced it as friction. And friction, when it's new, creates irritation before insight. I noticed a subtle shift in tone, mild impatience, a few strained jokes about how everything feels slower lately. Someone mentioned needing to tighten things up. The language was vague, but the discomfort underneath it was clear. What struck me was how quickly people reached for explanations that didn't involve responsibility. The workload was blamed, the timeline, external factors, anything but the removal of unspoken labor. I stayed steady. I didn't step in to smooth things over. Not because I wanted others to struggle, but because stepping in would have erased the information the system was now generating about itself. That information mattered. A few responsibilities were reassigned. Others were split across roles. Meetings were added to address things that had once been handled quietly, off the record. The cost of coordination increased. None of this was attributed to me changing. It was framed as growth pains, process evolution, necessary adjustment. That framing protected everyone's self-image, including mine. At one point, I was asked, casually, if I'd noticed things feeling more complicated lately. I said yes. That was all. Complication wasn't a complaint. It was an observation. The truth was that things hadn't become more complicated. They'd become more accurate. What people were feeling wasn't a loss of efficiency. It was a loss of subsidy. They were encountering the true cost of work that had previously been absorbed without record. That cost had a way of surfacing tension. Deadlines became more carefully negotiated. Authority lines were tested. Accountability had to be clarified where it hadn't been before. I watched all of this without commentary. This is the part that's hardest to explain to people who expect confrontation. Allowing consequences to unfold is not the same as causing harm. I wasn't withholding effort. I was simply no longer compensating for a system that had relied on my invisibility. There's a difference. Still, discomfort has a way of searching for a source. And slowly, attention began to turn. Not accusatorily, but inquisitively. Questions about alignment resurfaced. Conversations about expectations returned, this time with a sharper edge. I remained calm, consistent, present. By now, my silence reads differently. It wasn't misread as weakness anymore. It was experienced as distance. And distance, in systems built on access, creates unease. They could feel something had shifted. They just didn't yet understand what or how far. The consequences had begun. Not loudly, not punitively, but undeniably. And once begun, they didn't require my involvement to continue. By the time the system recognized something was wrong, it no longer knew where to apply pressure. That's the problem with delayed awareness. It arrives after the conditions for repair have quietly disappeared. The first signs of panic were subtle. A sudden increase in check-ins. Calendar invites framed as quick syncs. Language softened again, as if warmth could restore what had never been formally acknowledged in the first place. I recognized the shift immediately, not as care, but as recalibration. They were trying to reestablish the version of me they understood. There was talk of resetting expectations, of getting back to basics, of ensuring that everyone felt supported and aligned. These phrases floated through conversations without landing anywhere specific. No one named the sequence. No one referenced the original question that had started all of this, because to do so would have required admitting causality. I listened. I responded politely. I offered nothing new. That's when urgency entered the room. Suddenly, things that had never required explanation before now did. Processes were reviewed. Decisions were second-guessed. Someone asked, carefully, whether I felt seen. The word landed oddly, years too late. What they didn't understand was that visibility was no longer the issue. Trust was. I could feel the system reaching backward, trying to restore equilibrium by reoffering what it had once withheld. Not maliciously, not cynically, just too late. There's a moment when repair becomes impossible, not because of severity, but because of sequence. Once you've seen how a system behaves under mild stress, you can't unknow that knowledge. No reassurance can overwrite observed behavior. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even disappointed. I felt resolved. They asked if there was anything they could do to make things right. It was a sincere question, I think, but it assumed the problem was relational, not structural, that it could be addressed with conversation rather than accountability. I answered honestly, I don't think this is something that can be adjusted informally. That sentence changed the temperature of the room, not because it was threatening, but because it named a limit, a line beyond which tone and intention were no longer sufficient. From that point on, everything felt rushed. Follow-ups came faster. Offers were implied but never formalized. It was as if naming anything clearly might solidify it, and clarity now was dangerous. Regret has a particular sound in professional environments. It's quiet, procedural, filled with phrases like "in hindsight" and "moving forward." It avoids the present tense at all costs. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't press. I let the moment stand as it was. Too late doesn't mean. It means not now, not this way, not without acknowledging what already happened. And that acknowledgement never came. What surprised me most was how quickly concern turned into containment. Once it became clear that I wouldn't slide back into the old role, the system shifted again, this time toward minimizing exposure. Conversations narrowed. Decisions were made elsewhere. That told me everything. Repair had been conditional, and conditions, once revealed, clarify more than apologies ever could. By the time the door closed, softly, professionally, it wasn't a loss. It was confirmation. The system had done exactly what it was designed to do when challenged quietly, and I had done exactly what I needed to do to stop participating in that design. Nothing could be reversed now, not because I refused, but because I no longer needed reversal to feel whole. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. It took place in a small meeting room with neutral lighting and a table just large enough to create distance without feeling defensive. No one raised their voice. No one crossed their arms. There were no accusations, no denials, just careful language, measured pauses, and the unmistakable awareness that something irreversible had already occurred. They spoke first. They framed the conversation as a check-in, though the presence of an additional person told a different story. The tone was polite, professional, and faintly cautious. I recognized it immediately, not as hostility, but as containment. They asked how I was feeling about my role. I answered honestly, clear. That word seemed to disarm them. It didn't fit the script. They had prepared for dissatisfaction, maybe defensiveness. Clarity is harder to manage. There was a pause, then a question about whether I felt the expectations placed on me were reasonable. Yes, I said. They're clear now. Again, not the answer they were looking for. They referenced the performance improvement plan, not as an accusation, but as context. They spoke about growth, about alignment, about wanting to support me. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When they finished, I responded calmly. I understand the intent, I said, but the sequence matters. That was the closest thing to a confrontation in the room. I explained, briefly, factually, without emotion. The timeline, the request for overtime clarification, the subsequent shift in feedback, the absence of documented performance issues prior to that point. I didn't assign motive. I didn't speculate. I simply laid out events in order. There was no argument. No one challenged the facts. Silence settled, not uncomfortable but heavy. They asked what outcome I was looking for. This was the moment where, earlier in my career, I might have softened, might have asked for reassurance, might have tried to repair the relationship. Instead, I said, I'm not looking for an outcome. I'm naming reality. That was enough. The conversation didn't escalate. It didn't need to. Once reality is named cleanly, escalation becomes unnecessary. There was nothing left to negotiate. They acknowledged my perspective. They reiterated their commitment to fairness. They spoke about next steps in neutral terms. I nodded. I thanked them for the conversation. And that was it. No emotional release. No sense of triumph. Just a quiet understanding on both sides that something fundamental had shifted and that it wasn't going to be repaired through language alone. As I left the room, I felt lighter. Not relieved exactly. More aligned. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't attacked anyone. I had simply refused to participate in distortion. That, I realized, was the confrontation. Not heat, not force, just clarity held steady in a space that relied on ambiguity. And clarity, once introduced, changes the shape of everything around it. After everything settled, after the conversations, the recalibrations, the quiet closing of doors, I expected to feel something dramatic. Relief, anger, vindication. Instead, what arrived was steadiness. Not numbness, not detachment, just a grounded sense of self that hadn't been there before. For a long time, my identity had been shaped by how well I fit into systems, by how smoothly I could move within them without friction. I believed that professionalism meant minimizing impact, absorbing tension, being useful without being visible. That belief wasn't entirely wrong, but it was incomplete. Now, I understand myself differently. I'm still calm, still measured, still thoughtful, but my calm is no longer an open resource. It's something I deploy intentionally. I don't confuse restraint with availability. I don't offer clarity where it will be used to obscure responsibility. I no longer derive my sense of worth from how indispensable I appear. Indispensability, I've learned, is often a trap disguised as praise. It keeps you in place while others move freely. What's replaced it is something quieter and stronger. Self-authorship. I choose where my energy goes. I ask questions early, not to challenge, but to orient. I document not because I expect conflict, but because accuracy matters. I don't rush to fill silence. I let it do its work. There's no bitterness in this. Bitterness requires unresolved longing, for validation, for apology, for recognition. I don't need those things anymore. I've seen how systems behave when gently challenged. I've learned what they protect. That knowledge is sufficient. I also don't see myself as a victim. That framing would flatten the experience into something it wasn't. I participated longer than I should have because I believed in fairness without enforcement. That belief shaped my choices. I own that. What changed wasn't the world. It was my relationship to it. I no longer wait for permission to be clear. I don't mistake politeness for equity. I don't interpret discomfort as danger. Those shifts sound subtle, but they're structural. They affect every interaction that follows. When I enter a new environment now, I listen differently. I watch how requests are made, how boundaries are honored or not. I notice what happens when someone asks a precise question. These observations guide me more than any stated values. I've also learned that quiet doesn't have to mean invisible. It can mean deliberate. That strength doesn't require performance, and that the most durable form of dignity is internal alignment, not external approval. I carry myself differently now, not heavier, lighter, because I'm no longer managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. If there's a lesson here, it isn't stand up for yourself in the loud, simplified sense. It's something more restrained. Pay attention to sequence. Notice what happens when you ask calmly for fairness. Believe what the system shows you. Who I am now is someone who trusts that information. And that trust has made me unshakable in a way I didn't know was possible. This is where the story ends, not with a reversal, not with justice delivered in a single moment, but with understanding. For a long time, I believed fairness was something you earned by being reasonable, by staying calm, by not making things difficult. I thought that if I approached systems with patience and good faith, they would eventually respond in kind. What I learned instead is that systems don't respond to intention, they respond to structure. When I asked about overtime pay, I wasn't asking for special treatment. I was asking for clarity. The response I received wasn't accidental, it was procedural. And the timing was not a coincidence. It revealed something essential about how discomfort is managed when it threatens efficiency. There's a quiet lesson here, one that doesn't get talked about often because it isn't dramatic. Being dependable without boundaries doesn't protect you. It trains others to rely on your silence. And when that silence breaks, even politely, the system may try to correct you rather than itself. This isn't about villains. No one in this story needed to be cruel for harm to occur. All that was required was convenience, habit, and a lack of accountability. What resolved this for me wasn't confrontation or validation, it was alignment. I stopped asking the system to be fair and started deciding what I would participate in. That choice didn't make noise. It didn't punish anyone. It simply ended my role in something that depended on my invisibility. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. Pay attention to what happens after you ask a reasonable question. Not the words, those are often rehearsed, but the sequence, the shift in tone, the new language, the timing of scrutiny. Those details tell you more about a system than any stated value ever will. Quiet people are often underestimated, not because they lack strength, but because they don't advertise it. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop cushioning others from the consequences of their own design. I didn't win. I didn't lose. But I learned. And that learning has stayed with me, steady, usable, and intact. Now I'd like to hear from you. Have you ever asked for something reasonable and noticed the environment change afterward in ways that were never fully explained?